It's a very special moment for our center, our most venerable Maitreya Thero. I was thinking many times to invite him for a talk, and so many times he visited our place and had no much time for him to talk, because most of times he came here when we have ceremonies. So today finally I found this time, and he was so busy, and he only this time within this period he had opened. So somehow I found this time and I invited him, and he was so happy to come here, and as always. So behalf of our center, first of all I would like to invite our Mr. David Hudson to give an introduction about Venerable Sir, and thank you for coming, and after that you can deliver the Dhamma talk.
We're so grateful tonight to have Dr. Punnaji Thero, famous Dhamma master who's been teaching Buddhism in the West for more than 30 years. Born in Sri Lanka in 1929, graduated from the Ceylon Medical College, worked as a medical practitioner for a long time while learning the Dhamma from the late Venerable Narada Maha Thero in Vajirayanaya, Colombo, Sri Lanka. Later he entered the order of monks under the tutelage of the late Venerable Maitreya Thero, who was the Supreme Patriarch of Marapura Order of Buddhist monks in Sri Lanka. Been a professor at Taiwan's Fo Guang Buddhist University, was the director of Sri Lanka's former Mahindu Sarasvatiya, which means university movement. Currently he teaches at Buddhist Mahavihara, Brickfield, Malaysia, presents retreats and talks around the world. His books include Buddhism and Psychotherapy, Man to Superhuman, Did We Cross the Threshold of Hope, Beyond the Horizon of Time, and more. It's a great honor to have you here tonight. Thank you so much for being here.
So, with respect, I now invite Venerable Sir to deliver this Dhamma.
I'm very happy to see you all this evening, and we're also very happy to be present here, where there are a lot of Americans here, and this is a place where a lot of interesting activities going on. The chief monk here is a person who is interested in the kind of thing that I am also interested in. Of course he's from Sri Lanka, and also in an area where we had a university called the Mihidu Sarasavya at Mihintale. And Mihintale is a place where the Arahant Mahinda came to Sri Lanka carrying the teachings of the Buddha. So it's a very historical place where he has been born in. So that's also a great thing. So the topic today is awakening from the dream of existence. Now what that means is, we think we are existing, And from the Buddha's point of view, it's only a dream. It's not a reality. You know, there is a school of philosophy in the West, that started in the West, called existential philosophy. Their main idea that they uphold is existence. There have been many philosophers who have been called existential philosophers, but all these philosophers denied that they are existential philosophers. They didn't like to call themselves existential philosophers. But today, those who write books on existential philosophy, they name them as existentialists. The idea of existence was brought up really by a philosopher called Heidegger, who was a German philosopher. And what they point out is that out of all the animals existing in the world, the human being is the animal that is aware of his own existence. And not only that, the human being is also aware that he or she is going to die, which brings fears, anxieties, and worry. Everyone celebrates birthdays, but when it comes to death, they cry and lament about it. People don't realize that birth and death are the two ends of the same stick, which we call life. So to live is to be born, to die. Is that what we call existence? When we say, I am existing, are you referring to that baby that was born? Or are you referring to that young man or woman who got married? Or are you referring to that old man or woman who dies? You are changing all the time. From the time you are born, it is a gradual process of change. One philosopher said, you cannot enter the same river twice. Why? Because the second time you enter the river, it's a different river. The water is different. It's not the same water. In the same way, we can say we cannot meet the same person twice. Because every second, every moment, all cells that are in our body die and new cells come into being. Because our body is made of cells. So it's a new person. Even the mind is changing. The body is changing. The mind is changing even faster than the body. So are we really existing? When we think of existence, we are thinking of occupying two things, space and time. When we refer to ourselves, what are we talking about? Where is the self? Is it the body that we call the self? Or is it the mind that we call the self? Or is it something else? So we cannot even find out what the self is. Body is the thing that occupies space. The mind is not occupying space. The mind is occupying time. But does it occupy time? What is it that we refer to as mind? Is it a thought that comes into the mind? Is it the thought that we refer to as mind? Or is it a sensation that we refer to as mind? Or is it an emotion that we refer to as mind? There is no such thing as mind. What we call the mind is an activity of the body. When the Buddha spoke of the mind, he used three words: Chitta, Mano and Vijnana. The word Vijnana refers to perception. Perception means seeing is perception, hearing is perception, smelling is perception, tasting is perception, touching is perception. Touch. It's an activity of the senses. We have five senses: the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, and the body. The activity of these senses is what we call perception. We are organisms in an environment. Now the environment stimulates the organism. through these five senses. Light falling on the eye is a stimulation of the eye. Sounds coming to the ear is a stimulation of the ear. Smells coming to the nose is stimulation of the nose. Taste coming to the tongue is stimulation of the tongue. And touch coming to the body is a stimulation of the body. So when the environment stimulates these senses, the body reacts to the stimulus. And the reaction of the body to the stimulus is what we call perception. Seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. And that is what the Buddha called vijnana, perception. Once some people came to the Buddha and asked a question. Now we have these five senses. What we see with our eye is very different from the sound that we hear with our ears. And the smell that we get from our nose is different from both seeing and hearing. And the taste that we get in the tongue is another different thing. And the touch. So what are we really able to know about what we perceive? And how do these things come together? When we think of an object, we are able to see it, we can touch it, or if we tap it, we can hear a sound, but we think there is an object there. So if we think there is an object, how do I know it? Then the Buddha said, the different information that you get, one from the eye, another from the ears, another from the nose, another from the tongue, a different information, all that comes to one place, which he called Mano. Mano was the name given to that center. And today, if we ask a biologist who has studied about the human body, they will say, well, there are nerves going from the five senses, going to the brain. The optic nerve going from the eye to the brain. The auditory nerve going from the ear to the brain. The olfactory nerve going from the nose to the brain. Like that, different nerves carry messages like telephone wires, and the brain begins to think and give a meaning to what you saw or heard or smelled or tasted or touched. Really the meaning comes from all the organs, and you put everything together. When I say there is a glass of water here, All the information from the different senses are in that. So we form a concept. And today the modern psychologists have a name for that. That is called cognition. Cognition. And cognition means that we have given a meaning to what we saw. So the seeing is only perception. So after the perception comes cognition. So that cognition is also an activity of the body. There is a special part of the brain called the cerebrum. It is the activity of this part of the brain called the cerebrum that what we call thinking. Thinking is an activity of the brain. There is no special thing called a mind to do the thinking. It is the brain that is doing the thinking. And then, according to the meaning you give to that thing that you have cognized, an emotion is aroused. That emotion comes in the form of a liking or desiring, or you dislike what you saw, a hatred, or you may be frightened of what you saw, or you may be worried about what you saw. These are emotions. And what is an emotion? If you examine that, that is a complete change in the activities of the body. You ask a biologist or even a doctor, what is an emotion? A message goes from the brain to a gland in the body, and the gland secretes a thing called a hormone into the blood, and the blood begins to carry this to the whole body. When the heart is pumping, the blood carries this to the whole body, and changes begin to take place in the body. If, for example, you are angry, we call it an emotion, but anger is not just an emotion. Anger means the message goes from the brain to a gland called the adrenal gland, and a hormone called adrenaline gets into the blood. And this is carried to the whole body, and changes take place in the activities of the body. The heart begins to beat faster, the breathing becomes heavier, the muscles in the body becomes tensed, blood rushes to the face, the capillaries, the face becomes red, and the muscles in the face also gets distorted, and you begin to look like a devil. You see? So, all these things happen means a change in the body. So what we call an emotion is not a separate thing. It is a change in the body. So these three words that the Buddha used, one is perception, which he called vijnana, and then the cognition, that he called mano, and the emotion, that is called chitta. Chitta. And this emotion, once it is aroused, it doesn't stop there. That emotion is expressed in action, in the form of words or in the form of behavior. And that behavior can, if it is anger, the behavior can come in the form of fighting, quarreling, even killing. And that has bad consequences for the person who is doing it and also for the others who are around. And that is what the Buddha called karma. Karma or kamma. Kamma is the Pali word, karma is the Sanskrit word. So these words today, the modern psychologists are aware of this whole problem. What is that problem called? It was only recently that one psychologist who was also a biologist, who was a professor in Canada, somewhere in Ottawa or Montreal. His name was Hans Selye. I think it's the German name. And he wrote a book called Stress. That is how the word stress came into being. He was the first person to use that word, stress. And today everyone knows what stress is. And they pay a lot of money to learn how to manage stress. And it is this problem that the Buddha brought into the world, pointed out. It is called, the Buddha called it dukkha, today translated as suffering. But it's not just suffering, it is the stress that today people talk about. In other words, the problem is that the human being is an organism in an environment. And the environment stimulates the organism, and the organism reacts to the stimulus. And that reaction is what is called stress. Now, Hans Selye wrote a book called Stress Without Distress. What does that mean? stress without distress. Now what that really means is that people think that stress is something happening outside. But what he pointed out was, stress is not something happening outside. Stress is how you react to what is going on outside. It is the reaction of the organism to stimulation by the environment. And that reaction is creating all the problems in the world. This is what that psychologist who really started what is called psychotherapy was Sigmund Freud, who became aware of this reaction, the emotional reaction. And this emotional reaction is creating the problems. Not only crime, not only wars in the world, not only all the terrorism in the world, even inside neurosis, psychosis, and all the mental and physical problems also. So this has to be stopped. This is something that we have to learn to stop. But the problem is that these things are happening without our knowledge. We are not even conscious of what is going on. We are simply organisms in an environment reacting unconsciously, not consciously. It's only once it has happened that we know it has happened. This is why Sigmund Freud realized that if we are going to stop this, we have to become conscious of what is going on. If we are not conscious of what is going on, how can we stop it? And I cannot stop what is going on within you. You have to stop it. So that means one person cannot do for the others. Each person has to do it by himself or herself. It is what is called a do-it-yourself job. You cannot get other people to do it for you. Now, if you are sick, you might be able to go to a doctor and the doctor can do whatever is necessary. But a psychological problem, the doctor cannot do anything. You have to do it yourself. That's the problem. You have to be your own psychologist. Now the Buddha used a word which today people are translating in the wrong way. And that word is avijja. Today they translate that word as ignorance. Avijja is translated as ignorance. This is not ignorance. Avijja is unconsciousness. Everything is going on unconsciously. So we have to become conscious of this. It is only by becoming conscious of this problem that that problem can be solved. You see, when we speak of the mind, there are two important parts of what we call the mind. This is very important for us to understand, because we don't normally know this. One part is what we call the thinking part. The other part is what we call the emotional part. The thinking part and the emotional part. Sigmund Freud also was aware of this. And the emotional part he called the id, and the thinking part he called the ego. The id and the ego. Now the Buddha used two words to refer to these two parts. The emotional part he called chitta, and the thinking part he called mano. Today the modern psychologists have two words. One is called the cognitive, the thinking part is the cognitive, and the emotional part is called the affective. The cognitive and the affective. So it is very important to understand that we are having these two parts. Today, many Buddhists, especially the lay followers or the household followers, they take up what is called the 5 precepts. I hope you know about the 5 precepts. You should not hurt others or harm others. You should not steal. You should not commit adultery. You should not lie. You should not take intoxicants or hallucinogens and that kind of thing. Now, those are the 5 precepts. But there are really, although it goes in the form of 5 precepts, there are 10 real precepts there. So in any case, when they take up the 5 precepts, or when they recite the 5 precepts, what part of the mind is doing that? Is that done by the thinking part or that emotional part? Normally we have 2 terms that we use to refer to the thinking part and the emotional part. I forgot to tell you that. The thinking part we call the head, and the emotional part we call the heart. So this head and the heart doesn't mean that it is really the head and the heart. These are 2 words that we use to refer to the thinking part and the emotional part. So when we recite the 5 precepts, is it the heart doing that or the head doing that? It is the thinking part that is doing that. Because the thinking part is fully aware that it is not good to harm others or hurt others. Because if someone hurts me, I don't like that. So in the same way, other people also don't like to be hurt, and therefore I decide not to hurt anyone. Or if someone steals from me, I don't like that. In the same way, others will not like if I steal from them. So in a similar way, we think of all the 5 precepts and we make a decision not to behave in the wrong way. That is done by the thinking part. But we recite it here in the temple, and we go home, and the husband begins to fight with the wife, or the wife begins to fight with the husband, or maybe both parents begin to fight with the children, or the children begin to fight with the parents, or maybe you begin to fight with your neighbors, and so on, you see. But why? You have taken these 5 precepts. Who is doing the fighting? It is the emotional part that is doing the fighting, not the thinking part. So in other words, our emotions are going in one direction, the thinking is going in the other direction. In other words, we have 2 paths come in conflict. The thinking comes in conflict with the emotion, the head coming in conflict with the heart. This is the problem in the world. Today, with the advancement of modern science and technology, we have created, not even myself, but maybe the scientists have created wonderful things. Computer itself is a wonderful thing. Even this clock is a wonderful thing. Even the electric lights, wonderful. Television. Now people have even gone to the moon. Wonderful things. How did they do it? Through that thinking part. It is the head that is doing all that. But why did the head do that? Why did the head do all those things? It is because the emotions wanted. Emotions wanted not only those comfortable things, the emotions also wanted the nuclear weapons to kill and destroy. Now people are frightened, worried that if there is a nuclear war, that is the end of the world. You see? What does this mean? That the intellect or the head has become the slave of the heart, the emotions. The thinking part has become the slave of the emotional part. This is why with all the advancements in modern science, we are still filled with crime, filled with wars, filled with terrorism, filled with neurosis, filled with psychosis. Why? If our intellect has improved, why all these things? This is why the Buddha pointed out what we have to do is to get the head to dominate our mind, not the heart. This is the main thing in Buddhism. The teaching of the Buddha is to get the head to dominate our mind, not the heart. And if the heart has to calm down, the emotions we have to get rid of. What is an emotion? An emotion is a disturbance of not only the mind, it is a disturbance of the whole body and mind. It is not a normal thing. It is an abnormal thing. The normal thing is to stay calm and think properly. That's the normal thing. The abnormal thing is to get angry or become passionate and lustful, or maybe start worrying and crying and lamenting, become frightened. These are abnormal things, and today, according to Hans Selye, who wrote about stress, he called this a sickness. He pointed out that if the stress is going on, there are 3 stages in the stress. One is called the alarm reaction. That is like when there is an alarm reaction in a building or a house, or you hear a sound and then you begin to rush out of the house. Now that kind of alarm reaction is going on when, say, someone becomes very sick or dies or something happens in the environment, then the alarm reaction occurs. That is sometimes called the fight and flight response. Either you try to fight or you try to run away. That's the alarm reaction. Then, if this problem continues beyond this alarm reaction, if it continues for a long time, we come to the next stage called the stage of resistance. That means the body is now beginning to function in the wrong way. And that functioning means sickness. The body becomes sick as a result. The body becomes sick and the body becomes uncomfortable and the mind begins to start worrying and unhappy state. And the third stage is, if it goes on further, it is called the stage of exhaustion. And when it comes to the stage of exhaustion, that person might even die. Or maybe even commit suicide. All these things happen, which is not the normal thing. These are abnormal things. So stress can come in these different forms in this way. And that is why the stress has to be stopped. So this is why the Buddha pointed out that the only way to stop is first become conscious. And this is why we have what is called, today called the Noble Eightfold Path. And that Noble Eightfold Path begins with what? What is the beginning? There are 8 steps on the path. The first step is what is called Samma Ditti, which is today translated as right understanding or right view. That is really to become conscious of this problem. But simply by understanding, you have not become really conscious. You have become aware of the problem. You are aware that there is a problem here. But you are not fully conscious of the problem. You are only, it's a theoretical understanding that there is a problem. That is Samma Ditti. And then you understand what is called the 4 Noble Truths. What are these 4 Noble Truths? Excuse me. The 4 Noble Truths is to talk about dukkha, which is today translated as suffering, which is that stress, the cause of this suffering, which is today called craving. It's not craving, it is the emotion. It is the emotional reaction that is creating this problem. Emotion. And how to end the problem is to get rid of the emotions. Now, Sigmund Freud thought emotions cannot be got rid of, because he thought the emotions are coming from inside. Because Because in the body, there are organs that help in producing anger, fears, worries, anxieties, even the sexual glands producing lust, passion. So you see, the body, there are these things that produce the emotions. So he thought, we cannot get rid of emotions. So he thought the only way to get rid of emotions is not getting rid of emotions, he called it sublimation. And sublimation is not getting rid of emotions, it is using the energy behind the emotion to be sent along the right channels. Instead of satisfying your emotions in a destructive way, you try to use a constructive way of doing it. You do it in a socially acceptable way that does not harm other people or create problems. That is what he calls sublimation. But you know, fortunately, a new kind of psychology came into being. Which came after Freud. That is called cognitive psychology. What is this thing called cognitive psychology? They pointed out it is true that you have all the organs to produce anger or maybe sexual desires or maybe all the worries and fears and things like that. But those organs will not come into the working state until the thinking part begins to interpret your circumstance in a certain way. That means the cognitive process begins to act before the emotional arousal. So it is the cognitive process that interprets what is going on outside in the world, gives meaning to our circumstances. And if we learn to interpret our circumstances in the proper way, the anger will not be aroused. Or even the sexual desires will not be aroused. So now there is a thing called cognitive psychotherapy. What they are trying to do is whenever people are having problems, psychological problems, they try to change the way they interpret their circumstances. In a way, this is what Sigmund Freud tried to do also. Because the way we interpret our circumstances depend on the way we learn to think when we were children. Our childhood experiences and the way we interpreted our circumstances as a child begins to affect the way we interpret our circumstances as adults. So this is why Freud wanted to recall the past. And by thinking about the past, we can, with the adult mind, look at it and see that this is only a childish way of thinking. And you can change your way of thinking. It's the same thing but in a different way. So, although at that time Freud didn't understand it fully, but the later cognitive psychologists began to understand this better, and they are using this. And the most interesting thing is, there is a book of verses that you may be familiar with, which is coming from the teachings of the Buddha. It's called Dhammapada. You know that word. The first verse in the Dhammapada, what does the Buddha say? Mano pubbangama dhamma. Mano means that cognitive process. I told you that perception is followed by mano, it is the thinking part of the brain. Interpretation of the circumstance, which is what is called the cognitive process. Pubbangama means precedes, comes before. The thinking part comes before the emotional and the active part. Mano pubbangama dhamma. The thinking part precedes all experience. And he says, Manasache pasannena, manasache paduttena masativa karotiva. If a person interprets the circumstances in the wrong way, that person might become angry or greedy and then act in the wrong way, and as a result producing unhappiness to oneself as well as others. But if a person begins to interpret the circumstances in the right way, then that person will act in the right way, and as a result, everyone will be happy. That is what that verse is saying. So in other words, the Buddha saw this secret behind controlling the mind. And that is how he became a Buddha. Becoming a Buddha is learning to gain full control over the emotions, to completely get rid of three things: lobha, dosa and moha, which is today translated in various ways, but I like to translate it as lust, hate and delusion. Lust, hate and delusion refers to the emotion. It is by getting rid of emotions. A Buddha is a person who has got rid of all self-centered emotions. That is the meaning of becoming a Buddha. And all the self-centered emotions carry one very important thing: the self, the I. I want this, or I hate this. The I is the delusion. This is why we talk about awakening from the dream of existence. Existence means I exist. I exist is a delusion. And a delusion means it is not even a concept. A concept is a rational concept. This is an emotional feeling. The self is an emotional feeling. It's not a rational concept. Even if we are fully convinced that there is no such thing as a self, still we feel the self. We cannot give up the idea of self, because we are feeling the self, not just thinking self. The thinking came later. It is the feeling that came first. How did the feeling come? Of course, this is a long story. If I begin to start with that, I will need another few hours to explain this. So maybe if we get a chance later, I might be able to talk about it, but I leave this. Now it's almost 7:30, and the only thing is that we are dreaming. We are really unconscious. We are not fully conscious. That's why Sigmund Freud compared our mind to an iceberg. And the iceberg, only the tip of the iceberg comes up above the water, and the rest is under the water. In the same way, our consciousness is only a very subtle thing. We are mainly unconscious. We have to awaken from this dream that we are thinking, I am. It is only by awakening from this dream of existence. Because existence is a fallacy. It is called a static concept in a dynamic reality. The reality is dynamic, changing all the time. But existence is a static concept. We are thinking of existence where there is no real existence. You know, Charles Darwin, who spoke about what is called the theory of evolution, he saw this thing called life. What we call life is not a real life. What we call life is a chemical process. The chemical process means, you are familiar with this thing called atoms and molecules. Now, a new kind of molecule came into being. All molecules are made of atoms. Atoms go together to form a molecule. But every molecule has a special property, how the molecule behaves. But this new kind of molecule came into being not because someone created it or did something. Everything that happens in this world happens only due to the presence of the necessary conditions. When certain conditions are present, it happens. This is what is called determinism. Determinism means that every occurrence in the world is determined by the presence of the necessary conditions. It was in the 18th century that people in the West became aware of this thing called determinism. That is when science began. That was the time of Isaac Newton, Galileo and all these various scientists who came up. And that age began to be called the age of enlightenment. They call it the age of enlightenment. That is the time when people began to open their eyes. And otherwise, people thought that everything, when there is an earthquake or a hurricane or a tornado or whatever it is, it happened because of God doing it. But it is this age of enlightenment that people began to realize that whatever occurs in the world, whether it is earthquake or hurricane or whatever, always occurs due to the presence of the necessary conditions. That is what is called determinism. And that is what the Buddha brought into the world long before that age of enlightenment. He called it Paticca Samuppada, today translated as dependent origination. They are dependent on the conditions. That's what it means. So that is really the determinism. So it is because of this determinism that this thing called life came into being, when a new kind of molecule was formed, and this molecule had this ability to absorb atoms from the surroundings and produce molecules of its own kind. When they were able to produce new molecules, the number of molecules keep increasing. But there was another law, natural law, that is that everything that is integrated is subject to disintegration. That is what the Buddha called anicca. Sabbe sankhara anicca. So there were two processes going on at the same time, a building up process and a breaking down process. Two processes. Today the scientists have two names for these two processes. The building up process is called anabolism, and the breaking down process is called catabolism. And both together is called metabolism. So what we call life is really that process called metabolism. And it is this process that gradually began to build up what is called a cell. And the cells came together to form tissues, and the tissues came together to form organs. Organs came together to form systems, and the systems came together to form organisms, and the organisms kept on developing to produce plants, animals, and ultimately the human being came into being. When the human being came into being, this gradual process also began to develop what is called a brain. It was simply the nervous system that gradually begins to develop a thing called a brain. And with the coming of the brain, proper development, the human brain came into being. And it is this human brain which has what is called a cerebrum. It begins to think and reason out. And so we have what is called modern science, the scientific technology and all the wonderful things. You see, so it is this human brain that can ultimately become aware of this whole process, which is called the evolution. And not only that, become aware of this problem which Charles Darwin saw as a struggle for existence and the survival of the fittest. And this struggle for existence and the survival of the fittest, the Buddha saw the struggle for existence, but no one really survives. What survives is not the individual, what survives is the generation. It is the generation that keeps on going, producing more and more. Every human being that is born, what does the human being do? Even the animals, everyone is doing the same thing. What? They grow, reproduce and die. Grow, reproduce, die. What is the purpose? It was Alan Watts who began to say that we are just tubes. The tube, one end of the tube you put food in and the other end of the tube it goes out. So it's a tube. But this tube continues to produce other tubes and die. That's all that is going on. And that living itself is a very difficult thing. Even if a child is born, what does the parents do? They try to send the child to school. For what purpose? So that the child will learn something and be able to get a job where they can find food, clothing, shelter, and keep on living. But they also die. Before they die, they will produce more children, and then that is how it goes on. What's the purpose? They can only suffer. That is what is going on. What is left is suffering and nothing else. So why continue suffering? This is why the Buddha said, the main thing is to stop this struggle for existence. That will be the end of all the problems. We are only creating problems. Every time a child is produced, we are creating a problem. That child cannot be happy. He has to go to school. No one likes to go to school. And even when they get a job, they don't like to do the job. They don't like to get up early morning and go and do jobs. So it's not really a pleasure that we are thinking of. We are only trying to plug our ears with what is called music and then try to forget about that. It's an escape from the reality of suffering. We are only trying to run away from the reality into a world which is a fantasy. We are running away from reality into an imaginary fantasy. That is all that we are trying to do.
So first of all, I would like to give my sincere gratitude for the Venerable Bhante Punnaji Thero to giving us a very enlightened Dhamma talk today. And if you are interested about his teachings, and you can go online, and when you put his name, and all around the world that whatever the Dhamma talks he giving, and you can find out. And also he having a website called Proto-Buddhism, and through that all the new lectures and his ideas and his research about this Buddhism and science and new knowledge that you can find out through that website also. And so thank you very much for everybody participating here today. And I think actually that we inviting here many teachers to encourage you to practice. The finally that you have to practice yourself. That is the main thing. The teachers can give you some guidance and push you to practice and encourage you. So try to practice yourself, and then time to time we can help and we can give hand and we can give some supplements. So these kind of talks and Dhamma talks will help you to and walk in this path and understand some extra knowledge. And so with this all that I would like to transfer all the merits to our Venerable Sir. By the power of this all merits, may he be able to increase his longevity and knowledge and his all this good work, and he dedicating this everything to spread the Dhamma, and may he be able to achieve to the supreme bliss of Nibbana by the power of this all merits. And everybody says sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And so everybody, thank you very much for coming today, and we transfer these all merits to your past relatives and all the deities, and by the power of this all merits may you also be well and happy, peaceful, no harm, no difficulties, no problems come to you. May you also have patience, courage, understanding and determination to meet and overcome inevitable difficulties in your life, and finally may you also attain supreme bliss of Nibbana. So everybody transfer the merits. Idam me jnatinam hotu sukhita hontu jnatayo. Idam me jnatinam hotu sukhita hontu jnatayo. Idam me jnatinam hotu sukhita hontu jnatayo. Akasatta ca bhummatta devanaga mahiddhika punyantang anumoditva chiram rakkhantu sasanam. Akasatta ca bhummatta devanaga mahiddhika punyantang anumoditva chiram rakkhantu desanam. Akasatta ca bhummatta devanaga mahiddhika punyantang anumoditva chiram rakkhantu loka sasanam.